The production of Superman 2 was very complicated.
Haven't you ever heard of freedom of the press?
Would you care to step outside?
Originally in 1977, they were filming Superman 1 and Superman 2 back to back, but it was a pretty chaotic process, especially considering the fact that they had to edit Superman 1. So after having about 75% of Superman 2 filmed, they kind of just put it to a halt so they could just focus on finishing Superman 1. However, the director Richard Donner did not return when they started filming the rest of Superman 2 because the producers just didn't get along very well with him. There were some creative disagreements, and so they chose to not have him come back, and Richard Lester ended up being the new director instead. However, Donner had completed about 75% of Superman 2, but in order for Richard Lester to be credited as a director, he had to have filmed at least 50% of it. So the version of Superman 2 they released in theaters was 50% shot by Richard Donner, and it was 50% shot by Richard Lester. So the theatrical version came out in 1980, but in 2006 on DVD they released the Donner cut, which has all 75% of the stuff he shot, along with some of the stuff Lester filmed just because they needed it for context. And after years of having two different versions of this movie, it's time to answer the question, which version is superior? So we're going to look at the pros and cons at the theatrical cut and the Donner cut. And just to start off with a generalization, the theatrical cut does feel more complete. And in terms of the Donner cut, I feel like they removed a little bit too much of Lester's footage. And I understand a lot of it definitely needed to be cut, but there were some things just for context that I feel like could have stayed. And so the Donner cut's about 10 minutes shorter overall, which makes the pacing feel a little bit more rushed at times. And so I would say the theatrical cut does have better pacing. There's also more destruction in a lot of the action scenes. However, a downside to that is that there's a lot of slapstick comedy also in the added scenes. Whereas the Donner cut doesn't have that stuff, thankfully. But when it does come to the Donner cut, it's not just the pacing that's kind of a problem, it's also the fact that there's test footage used at this one scene, which really does take you out of the experience. It's the scene where Lois discovers Superman's identity, and I don't even think what they did with her shooting Clark actually made sense because he would have been able to see with his super speed that there was no bullet and it was a trick. Whereas in the theatrical cut, Clark is just more clumsy, and then he stumbles into the fire and survives, which I understand for a lot of people that's kind of a bit of a stretch. It doesn't make much sense, but I think it was just kind of a psychological thing where he basically forced himself into doing it because that's how bad deep down he actually really did want Lois to know his secret identity. Although again, I can understand why for some people that's more of a stretch. I'm not going to put it in the pro section, but I'm also not going to put it in the con section. On the topic of the Niagara Falls thing though, a huge con for the theatrical version is they cut anything that set that up. It just comes out of nowhere where they're at the hotel. Whereas in the Donner cut, they talked about it before it happened. Now, although the theatrical cut didn't set up the Niagara Falls thing, it did indeed set up the freshly squeezed orange juice gag that kind of goes a little bit throughout the film. Whereas it just comes out of nowhere in the Richard Donner cut. Although, I mean, freshly squeezed orange juice versus Niagara Falls, you know, one's a lot more important to the plot than the other.
Golly, Lois, what are you doing?
Nobody cares!
Now, diving into a few more specific scenes, though, if we go to the Donner cut, the way it starts off, it actually uses the events of the first film to set up the conflict in this film, where the nuclear missiles led to the explosion, freeing the villains from the Phantom Zone. And so that's worthy of the pro section. And in the theatrical cut, there's a completely different action sequence. And just between the two, I prefer what they did in the Donner cut, but I'm not going to put the Superman 2 version of the action sequence in the con section. It's perfectly fine and memorable. It's just the Donner cut goes the extra mile by kind of making a bridge where the story of Superman 1 leads directly into Superman 2. Also a pro in the Donner cut, Lois suspects that Clark is Superman from the beginning. First scene with her, that's what she's doing. And another pro, Lois tests the waters and risks her life to make Clark turn into Superman and save her. Obviously, he does something different, but I think that's definitely a great scene. Whereas in the theatrical cut, we just get this weird scene of Clark Kent being clumsy and he destroys this car in traffic, which just makes no sense because he could have easily avoided that. And yes, I defended him falling in the fire, but I don't think deep down in his heart he wanted to destroy some random guy's car. Now, there is a scene in the theatrical cut where Lois kind of does a similar thing by risking her life in Niagara Falls. And that deserves being in the pro section for the theatrical cut because I think they should have added it in the Donner cut as well. I feel like it's okay to have both scenes because it just kind of adds to Lois's suspicions. But let's get to the really big stuff here. Obviously, Marlon Brando being in the Donner cut is the biggest pro on this entire list. And just how he gets his powers back with that kind of stuff, it's a lot more emotional and makes way more sense, and he's sacrificing being able to talk to his father by doing so. Whereas in the theatrical cut, it's not the same with the other Kryptonian messages, and even though most of that movie flows together a lot more nicely, him getting his powers to that specific plot point is actually rushed. Now when it comes to how the movies end and that kind of stuff, there's some very stupid stuff they do in the theatrical cut, like with Superman's new powers where he's throwing his S in the final battle. And then he hypnotizes Lois to make her forget about everything at the end. Like, that's just very weird. I think it would have been fine if she just knew his identity. Now, there is a very good scene, though, in the theatrical cut where Superman returns the flag to the White House and he basically says, "I'm not going to let you guys down again." And because of that, I really do believe the ending in the theatrical cut is better than the Donner cut, because in the Donner cut, it's just a complete mess. He destroys the Fortress of Solitude for no reason when I'm pretty sure Lex Luthor was still in there. And then he just reverses time so nothing in the movie actually ever happened, which is the same way the first movie ended, except he didn't erase the whole movie. And in this case, why would he destroy the Fortress of Solitude if he was just going to go back in time? And also, why did he destroy it in the first place? So I think both versions could have definitely ended better if they just had him not reverse time, not hypnotize Lois, and just have her know his identity. So at the end of the day, some of the pros are bigger than other pros, and some of the cons are bigger than other cons. So simply by judging off the number of pros and cons in each category, that's not really enough to tell which movie is actually better. It's completely subjective, and I hate not giving you a definitive answer. I think we can all really agree just a completed version of the Donner cut would have worked well, and I think we have enough footage from each cut that we can make a pretty much perfect version. Someone just needs to pirate both movies and edit it together in a way where it's that perfect version. We could have like a top 5 comic book movie. And again, there are some smaller details in each version of the movie that I did not cover. But let me know in the comments section down below which version of the movie you prefer, if you do prefer one over the other. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I'll see you guys next time.